My name is Greg Hess. I'm a physician, a forensic pathologist, and chief medical examiner for Pima County here in Tucson, Arizona. And I am participating in a short video introduction to one aspect of the problem with migration in southern Arizona. And that is that when people cross into the United States without permission from the government to do so, sometimes people die in the attempt because it's a very remote area. People get left behind, and we have to try to figure out how those people that got left behind died and identify who they are. So in the 1990s, we would have very few migrant remains that we would find in the desert. So it's always kind of been a problem just because of the remoteness of the area and the heat and where we are. But for example, we maybe find 10 to 15 people a year that we would now classify as an undocumented border crosser. Then that suddenly jumped up to about 75 remains in 2000 and 77 in 2001. And then in 2002 it was 146. And then in 2019, essentially 20 years later, after the first year this really became a problem for us in 2000, we had 136. So even though apprehensions have been down in the Tucson sector of the Border Patrol, which is where we are, we still find a large number of people that have died in comparison to the number of remains we found before this really became a problem for us in 2000. So people come here to learn about why is that and how we deal with this problem. And essentially the remains that we find are a side effect of where people cross. So back in the 80s and 90s, people would, if they were going to cross into the United States from Mexico, they would do it in major population areas like just walk across the street from Tijuana into San Diego, or across the bridge from Juarez into El Paso. And that's where most of the apprehensions were, the Border Patrol apprehensions. And so in order to potentially decrease the number of people that were crossing without permission, Border Patrol made it more difficult to cross in those major population areas. So they put up a lot of fencing and deterrence for people to cross there. It did decrease the number of people that were crossing in major population areas, but it didn't work in that it didn't decrease the number of people that were crossing in total. It just moved them to other places. So people essentially funneled from the West Coast in Tijuana and San Diego, and a little bit further east in Juarez and El Paso in through southern Arizona through the Tucson sector, and that's where we are. So that's why we started to see a large uptick in the number of people that died in the desert, and it created a lot of problems for us. So the issues we have with these type of remains is not necessarily determining how people die, like the cause of death. It is determining who they are. So it's almost like a plane crashing every year in the desert. So if let's say a plane crashes, a mass fatality event, it's a similar concept in that the challenge is not necessarily determining how those people died. They died as a result of injuries they received from the plane crash. It's figuring out who those people are so you can get the remains back to their family members. So different situation, and it's not like a plane crashing all at one time, but it's about 150 people dying a year in this particular group who you have no idea who they are initially, even if they're in good condition and they may have some type of paperwork or property or identification with them that has a name. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's them. So you really have to work with a lot of other people in groups to confirm an identity or rule out name associations to get to who the person might be. So when we bring in remains, they're in all kinds of different conditions, all the way from people that are fully fleshed and found right away and in good condition to skeletal remains of people that probably died a year or two ago, and then everything in between. And really the odds and length of time it takes us to identify people is proportional to the condition of the remains when they come in. So if you just have a single bone, and you know it's human, you can imagine that it would be difficult to identify that person by anything short of DNA. And even if you take the DNA of that unknown person or that bone, you still have to have something to compare it to. So you really have to have access to family members who might be looking for that person to compare their DNA to that sample that you recovered to see if those people are related. So that's part of the issue of how people come in, and then how we have to work with other groups to try to figure out who they are. So we work a lot with foreign consulates, so the Mexican consulate, Guatemalan consulate, in trying to identify where family members might be if they're still in a potential country of origin. Sometimes families will have reached out to people in those consulates, and they may have something resembling a missing persons report that we could use to compare against the remains that we found. We work with Border Patrol in that if we take fingerprints from a deceased person, we can compare those fingerprints to Border Patrol's database to see if that person may have been apprehended before, and if they were, if Border Patrol took a photograph of them, we know what they look like, and that could be helpful. We work with a lot of non-governmental organizations. We work with Humane Borders, which is a NGO that deals with putting water in the desert with the goal that if you put water where people may have been found deceased, then maybe it will prevent people from dying potentially of dehydration in the future. And so we work with a mapping system with them that's called the Open Geographic Information System, or OGIS for short. And anyway, they plot the location of where remains are found in the desert, and anybody can go look at it. So it's kind of compelling to see, where people have died, and it provides information about those remains. Because sometimes visually looking at it is more impactful than just listening to someone talk about it. We work with the Colibri Center, which is another nonprofit humanitarian organization, and they deal with missing persons. So that's another whole issue that is kind of separate from us, but really what we do at the medical examiner's office is we deal with unidentified persons, so the remains of somebody who we don't know who they are. The other side of that is the missing person side, so that would be collating information from families who are looking for a loved one that they can't find. So typically the way that works in the United States, missing persons that is that it's a law enforcement function. So if someone in your family goes missing and they didn't show up and you can't find them, it's really law enforcement that you turn to file a missing persons report. It's not the medical examiner's office. Now for this group of people, there's a disincentive to identifying themselves to local law enforcement because they may be in the country, they may not be here legally, and their loved one who they're looking for was doing something considered illegal, right? Crossing into the United States without permission to do it. So there's kind of a disincentive for people to want to interface with law enforcement, and so people over time have reached out to us directly and showed up at the office or called the office and wanted to tell us about their family member who was supposed to cross from Mexico into Arizona, and now they're missing. And so, we don't have anybody that works in missing persons. We don't have personnel or some kind of database to collect that information and compare it against unidentified persons that we might recover. And so we've worked with different groups over time to help us with that, and right now it's the Colibri Center. So they have hundreds, if not thousands, of missing persons reports, and they compare those reports that come in from all kinds of places to remains that we've recovered, and we have identified people that way. So that's a big help. So what I just described is fairly unique in the United States. Really, handling of migrant deaths is limited to those jurisdictions on the border, and then the way that happens is different depending on where that's located. So states run different death investigation systems. Some of them are funded by the state, some of them are funded by local government, like the counties, like it is in Arizona. And so it's pretty patchwork on how these deaths are investigated, the success rate of identifying people, and whether or not there's really any information about this group is solely dependent on the location of where you ask for that information. So that's a little bit depressing because it's not like it's a federally funded, centralized effort to keep track of this group separately. It's not. So it's really just up to the local population.
Sure,
This
yeah.
might be a good time, if you're planning it, to talk about how you deal with pretty much the entire border for this sector of Border Patrol, and compared to the small counties and other places that don't have the medical expertise.
So I wanted to explain a little bit better about how this happens border-wide. So if you're looking at the U.S.-Mexico border, clearly you can look at it on a map and understand that if you're going from west to east, you're really looking at California, and then Arizona, then New Mexico, and then Texas. And that's really the border of the United States with Mexico, at least the land border. And if you look at the border, the southwest border, through a federal agency like Border Patrol, they divide the border up into sectors. And typically how that works is they'll take a major city on the southern border and then a slice of the United States going north and call that whole slice the sector. So for Border Patrol, if you're going west to east, it's essentially San Diego, and then El Centro, then Yuma, then Tucson, then El Paso, and then you have the Texas sectors that I don't have memorized. But you can look at a slide and see what those sectors are. What's interesting is that Border Patrol will report statistics by sector. So if you're interested in learning about the issue, you can look at the number of apprehensions by sector over time, and Border Patrol publishes that information on their website, and it'll be part of the PowerPoint associated with this short talk to look at where people have crossed over time. They also keep track of deaths by sector, and the apprehension numbers go back a lot further. So they go back to like the 1960s or something, where the death numbers don't go back that far. They go back to the mid-90s. So it's not, you can't directly line up the apprehension statistics by sector and the Border Patrol reported deaths by sector to look at it all the way back, but you can for at least the last few years. And they do it by federal fiscal year, so it's not by calendar year. So people have to keep that in mind too. Anyway, the reason I'm talking about this is because if you want to see where people have crossed over time, you need to look at the apprehension numbers and see how that's changed. And again, if you look at the apprehension numbers in the 80s and early 90s, it was San Diego and El Paso sectors of the Border Patrol, and now and then it moved to Tucson, and now it's moved back to some of the Texas sectors, and it's just the ebb and flow of people over time. The death numbers don't marry up to the apprehension numbers quite as nicely because, for example, here in the Tucson sector, we have much fewer apprehensions than we did in the mid-2000s, but we still have a high number of people dying and remains that we find. So don't have a great explanation for that, but it's just kind of interesting to look at if you're not just focusing on where we are here. Also, when you look at those Border Patrol sectors, we have to realize that those represent different death investigation systems. So in San Diego, they have an appointed forensic pathologist medical examiner. In El Centro, it's an elected sheriff that also serves as a coroner. In Yuma, which is the far western slice of Arizona, which is its own sector, they have not sure what they have now because they just changed their system. Then we're here in southern Arizona, where we have an appointed forensic pathologist medical examiner, and here in Pima County we happen to be the southern portion of the entire Tucson sector. So if you look at the Tucson sector on a map, and we'll have that associated with this talk, you'll see that Pima County, Santa Cruz County, and Cochise County are the southern portion of the Tucson sector of the Border Patrol, and all three of those counties come here to Tucson for their death investigation system. So it's fairly standardized and centralized, so it's a good window into all of these types of deaths in that sector. The El Paso sector of the Border Patrol is actually the far western tip of Texas that has El Paso in it, and the state of New Mexico. So the El Paso sector is mostly New Mexico and not really Texas. So it's kind of interesting when you look at it that way. Different death investigation systems feed into that because El Paso is a medical examiner system separate from a state-funded system, which is New Mexico, out of Albuquerque. It's not done county by county. And then when you go to Texas, it gets much more broken up because it's a county by county death investigation systems. Many of them are run by what they call a JP, or Justice of the Peace. And one county may have multiple JPs in it, and a JP is sort of a sheriff, a coroner, judge, all rolled up into one person over these larger rural geographic areas. So there's no, you can just imagine how haphazard information gathering is in those areas because none of it's centralized. So anyway, it seems like an attempt to confuse the issue. Bottom line is nobody knows how many of these types of deaths there are in the United States because there's no central accounting. If you look at the Border Patrol death numbers, and you'll also see in the PowerPoint, they don't necessarily line up with the number of remains that we find because Border Patrol counts deaths by incident reports, meaning that if a Border Patrol agent finds human remains, they write an incident report. They don't investigate the death. That's the job of whatever local law enforcement agency there is with the remains that are found, but now they have an incident report for it. So over the last few years, if you look at the reported deaths, those are just incident reports that Border Patrol finds the remains. But we know by experience here in the Tucson sector that Border Patrol finds slightly less than 50% of the total number of remains. So since about 2015, the Border Patrol death number is about 50% of the total number, at least in the Tucson sector. So what is it border-wide? So it's confusing. So when people come to talk about how many of these types of remains there are in these types of deaths in the United States, total, nobody really knows. Here, at least in the Tucson sector where it's centralized, here in Pima County, we have a better idea, but I don't know what it is for the rest of the United States. So in kind of to elaborate a little bit more on a topic that we touched on a little bit, there'll be a kind of a graphic in the PowerPoint that goes over body condition. And body condition is just kind of a way for us to be more objective about how long ago it was that somebody died when we find their remains. So I've already mentioned that we find remains that are in good condition from people that are fully fleshed all the way down to skeletal remains. And when we talk about skeletal remains, essentially if somebody dies outside in this environment and they're not protected from the animals and insects and the weather and everything else, you can essentially have somebody that's rendered almost completely to skeletal remains within a few weeks. But skeletal remains that are a few weeks old versus skeletal remains that might be 5 years old are a big difference. So skeletal remains aren't just one group. They may represent people that died relatively soon in comparison when they were found versus people that were in the desert for much longer. So anyway, put that on a scale from about 1 to 7, and there's a graph in there, number 1 being people that are fully fleshed, and then number 7 being skeletal remains that are months to potentially years old, and then everything in between. And when you look at that, we think of the number 1s, or the people that are fully fleshed. Most of the time the scenario is somebody traveling with a group of people and somebody falls behind that particular group and they can't keep up, but somebody in that group may call for help, and help comes in whatever form, 911 or EMS or Border Patrol, BORSTAR unit, or whoever it might be, but they don't arrive in time. So the person is deceased, but the remains aren't left behind and not recovered. So that person might come in to the office as a foreign national that died coming into the U.S., but they're in good shape, and versus the people who might be left behind the group that they're traveling with. Maybe somebody calls for help, but they're not found, or somebody doesn't call for help until much later and the remains aren't found. So that person might be in the desert for a longer period of time before someone finds them. Who finds remains? Already mentioned that Border Patrol finds about 50% or slightly less than that. So Border Patrol agents out in the environment on patrol come across human remains. They call law enforcement. Law enforcement comes to the scene of the death and they do a preliminary investigation, and then they send the remains to us. The other 50% of remains are found essentially by everyone else. So hunters, hikers, ranchers, ATVers, humanitarians that might be out in the environment. If they find human remains, they call law enforcement too, not Border Patrol, and law enforcement will come, and the process, is the same as I already mentioned. So we have some photographs associated with an article written by a journalist at the Cronkite School of Journalism at Arizona State University in Phoenix. Her name is Terry Green Sterling. And if people Google Death in the Desert and look for Terry Green Sterling's name, she had this story published in Newsweek. It's called Death on the Border. And this is the story about two individuals that we identified here. We identified them here some years ago. But essentially they're a good example of the story that I just described. So someone found skeletal remains out in the desert, and you may be able to see in the photographs that the remains are of two people who are not easily identifiable. They're both full skeletal remains. One turned out to be an adult woman. Her name was Maria from Guatemala, and the other one turned out to be an adolescent boy. His name was Nelson or Omar, and he was also from Guatemala. And what happened is that Nelson's mother was living in Phoenix, and he was back in Guatemala, and he wanted to join her. And his mom wasn't very happy with that he wanted to come into the United States, but she didn't feel like she could really stop him. So he was going to travel with a group, and they arranged him to come and cross the border through Arizona, and his neighbor, Maria, was going to accompany him. But as it turns out, when they were here in the desert, Maria fell behind the group that they were traveling with, and Omar stayed back with her. And so when the group got to some destination, they actually had Omar's mother's number, and they called her and told her that. And so she had essentially been looking for them since that time. And it took a couple years for them to be identified, but what she did was she didn't file a missing persons report with law enforcement. She reached out to the author of the story, which was a journalist interested in border-related issues, and it was kind of the journalist that was looking on their behalf, and that's how we were called, essentially, with somebody trying to file a missing persons report, saying, have you found an adult, female and adolescent male? And we just so happened to have these skeletal remains, which were a little bit unique because we had two people in the same location, one of which we knew was an adult female, and the other one we later learned was this adolescent male, and they were both identified through DNA, because it was really the only way to identify them. Omar comparing his DNA to his mother's DNA, which was collected in Phoenix, and Maria to DNA from her family members in Guatemala. So reading that story that she wrote and looking at those pictures is just a good example of how this happens, how these deaths occur, and oftentimes we don't get a very good backstory or a complete story about who these people are, even if we identify them. In this particular case, we did, and it was written down nicely by someone else, so it provides a good backdrop. Cause of death is another topic that we didn't go into fully, but I mentioned earlier that cause of death isn't the biggest challenge, it's the identification. But let's talk about cause of death for a minute. So there's a pie graph that's associated with this talk that goes over cause of death from 2000 to the end of 2019. So 20 years of cause of death in this group. And one might think that all these deaths are heat-related or related to the environment, because we do find more remains in the summertime. It gets very hot here, and many of them are. But the number one cause of death that we've certified over the years is actually undetermined. And how could we not know how the person died? So we'd say, well, undetermined. We don't really know how they died. essentially because the remains are decomposed to the point where we can't say for certain. So even if somebody dies from the environment, so hyperthermia, for example, dehydration would be lumped into the same category. It's really a diagnosis of exclusion. So there isn't anything specific we can do after death to determine somebody was too hot and essentially died from hyperthermia when they were alive. So we look for and rule out other causes. So there are injuries associated with their death, do they have any underlying natural medical conditions, etc. But the remains have to be in a good enough condition for us to look for other causes before we can really determine that we think they died from exposure or hyperthermia. So for those remains that are too decomposed for us to really do a complete examination, we call the cause of death undetermined. So a lot of the skeletal remains, the cause of death will be undetermined. That said, the vast majority of the fully fleshed remains that we examine are people that we believe died from exposure. So probably most of the skeletal remains that we're examining are people that died from exposure. We simply can't prove it. So really that's 1 and 2. Undetermined, number 1. Exposure-related deaths, number 2. And then you have other causes of death that are less common after that. But really what we don't have is a lot of criminal firearms-related injuries. So that narrative has come up periodically over the years, that people are coming across the border and dying in like a hail of gunfire or something, which is not our experience. So we do have people that have been shot and maybe part of a smuggling operation, smuggling people, smuggling drugs, but it's uncommon. There's like 3% or so of the total number of remains that we've examined. So it occurs, but does not appear to be the vast majority of these remains and these types of deaths. We believe the vast majority of them are more similar to the story that I talked about with Maria and Omar.